On July 26, 2025, the U.S. Commerce Department imposed 20.56% anti-dumping duties on Canadian softwood lumber, pushing combined tariff rates above 34%. This single decision affects $13 billion in annual trade flows, threatens 40,000 forestry jobs across British Columbia, and could add $14,000 to $20,000 to the cost of building an American home by 2027. To understand why this matters, we need to grasp the sheer scale of North American lumber interdependence. Canada supplies 69% of U.S. lumber imports, representing 12 billion board feet annually. That's roughly 25% of total U.S. softwood consumption flowing across a single border. When we drill down to construction-specific lumber, the dependency becomes even more pronounced. 70% of lumber specifically imported for U.S. home construction originates from Canada, making this trade relationship absolutely critical to American housing markets. The geographic concentration of this industry creates additional vulnerabilities. British Columbia alone produces 64% of Canadian lumber exports, with Quebec contributing another substantial portion. This means that weather patterns, forest fires, or regulatory changes in just 2 Canadian provinces can ripple through American construction sites from Seattle to Miami. The BC forestry sector represents approximately $10 billion annually, with the United States serving as the single largest export market. When American tariffs hit, they don't just affect trade statistics, they reshape entire regional economies. This isn't a new conflict. Softwood lumber disputes between the United States and Canada trace back to the late 1700s, with modern iterations beginning in the 1980s as global trade volumes expanded. The last temporary resolution came in 2006 through a truce agreement that featured export charges during periods when market prices fell below certain thresholds. That deal expired in 2015, setting the stage for the current escalation. The previous duty cycle started with a combined rate of 14.54%, which has now risen to the current 34.45%, representing more than a doubling of trade barriers in less than a decade. What makes this particularly significant is that we're not dealing with manufactured goods that can be easily sourced from multiple global suppliers. Lumber is heavy, bulky, and expensive to transport long distances. Geographic proximity matters enormously in this industry, which is why Canadian forests have naturally served American construction markets for generations. Now, that natural economic relationship is being deliberately disrupted by trade policy, creating the potential for massive market distortions and unintended consequences that extend far beyond the forestry sector itself.
The current tariff structure operates through a sophisticated dual-track system that many people find confusing. But understanding it is crucial to grasping why these duties are so devastating to Canadian producers. The Commerce Department has imposed anti-dumping duties of 20.56% based on their determination that Canadian companies are selling lumber in the U.S. market below fair value. Simultaneously, there are countervailing duties currently set at a preliminary rate of 6.74%, though this is pending a final review that could push the combined rate to 34.45% or higher. The legal foundation for these measures rests on U.S. claims that Canadian stumpage fees for harvesting timber on Crown land constitute unfair government subsidies. In Canada, most forests are publicly owned and companies pay stumpage fees to provincial governments for the right to harvest trees. The U.S. argues these fees are set artificially low, effectively subsidizing Canadian lumber production and allowing companies to undercut American competitors. Canada disputes this characterization, arguing that their stumpage system reflects legitimate market pricing and sustainable forest management practices. The financial mechanics of how these duties actually work reveal the true burden on Canadian companies. The duties aren't paid by American consumers at the point of sale, as many people assume. Instead, Canadian companies pay these duties through their U.S. subsidiaries when the lumber crosses the border. This has already totaled an estimated $7 billion to date, representing a massive cash flow impact on Canadian forestry operations. These companies are essentially paying a penalty for accessing their largest export market. What makes this particularly painful is the retroactive requirement. Companies must now remit duties on products shipped to the United States since January 1, 2023. That's 31 months of back payments that many smaller producers simply cannot afford. According to the BC Independent Wood Processors Association, this requirement could force small BC producers to shut down entirely and may threaten operators' personal assets as they risk using their homes as collateral to secure bonds for these payments. Adding another layer of complexity, billions of dollars in collected duties are currently held in escrow pending legal challenges. If Canada ultimately prevails in trade tribunals or World Trade Organization proceedings, these companies could potentially receive refunds. However, that process typically takes years, and many smaller operations don't have the cash flow to survive that long. The enforcement timeline shows how this situation has escalated rapidly. In March 2025, the Commerce Department announced a preliminary anti-dumping rate of 20.07%, up from the previous 7.66% rate that had been in place for 3 years. By July 26, 2025, they issued their final determination at 20.56%. Looking ahead, August 1, 2025 marks when a potential 35% tariff on non-USMCA compliant goods could take effect, while the final countervailing duty determination is expected in late 2025.
This technical structure creates a compounding effect where Canadian companies face multiple layers of trade barriers simultaneously. They're not just dealing with a single tariff rate, but rather a complex web of duties that can change every few months based on Commerce Department reviews and broader trade negotiations. For companies trying to plan investments, manage cash flow, or negotiate long-term contracts, this uncertainty becomes almost as damaging as the duties themselves. When we examine the actual production capacity numbers, a stark mathematical reality emerges that contradicts much of the political rhetoric around American lumber self-sufficiency. The United States currently has 47 billion board feet of sawmill capacity as of 2024, but these mills are operating at an average of just 79% utilization. At first glance, this suggests significant room for expansion, with roughly 7.5 billion board feet of surplus capacity available. However, when we compare this to actual Canadian imports of 12 billion board feet annually, the supply gap becomes immediately apparent. Even if American mills could somehow achieve 95% utilization, which industry experts consider the practical maximum when accounting for seasonal production trends and necessary maintenance downtime, the United States would still fall short by 3.2 billion board feet. This isn't a matter of political will or trade policy preference. The U.S. market mathematically cannot clear without Canadian supply at current demand levels. The infrastructure constraints go far deeper than simple capacity utilization rates. Rural mill operators across the country report chronic workforce availability issues that make it difficult to maintain current production levels, let alone expand them. Finding reliable workers in remote forestry communities has become a constant challenge, and adding second or third shifts to existing operations runs headlong into these labor shortages. Even where workers are available, mills face technical bottlenecks in critical processes like kiln drying and planing capacity that limit how much additional production can be squeezed from existing facilities. The idea of replacing Canadian imports with domestic federal timber harvests reveals even more daunting challenges. According to industry analysis, the United States would need to increase federal timber harvests by 450% to offset Canadian imports. This isn't just a matter of cutting more trees. The U.S. Forest Service is chronically under-resourced and ill-equipped to manage such a massive expansion. Environmental groups would inevitably challenge proposed logging operations through the courts, creating years of delays. Perhaps most critically, the timber industry faces severe workforce shortages not just in mill operations, but across the entire supply chain, including loggers, truck drivers, road builders, and specialized mill workers. Despite these constraints, American investment patterns show the industry has been responding to trade protection measures. Since 2016, U.S. mills have added 8.8 billion board feet of capacity through new mill construction and expansions of existing facilities. During this same enforcement period, the industry has produced 30 billion additional board feet of softwood lumber. These numbers demonstrate that trade protection can stimulate domestic investment, but they also highlight the gap between policy goals and physical reality.
Interestingly, Canadian companies have adapted to these trade barriers by pursuing a strategy that might seem counterintuitive. Major Canadian forestry companies are opening new mills in the United States while simultaneously facing closures of domestic operations. This allows them to serve the American market without paying duties, but it also represents a fundamental shift in the geography of North American lumber production. Canadian companies are essentially being forced to move their operations south of the border to remain competitive. The lumber tariffs create ripple effects that extend far beyond sawmills and forestry operations, fundamentally altering the economics of American construction. To understand the scope of this impact, we need to examine the broader construction materials ecosystem.
In 2023, approximately $13 billion worth of construction materials were imported, representing 7% of the total $184 billion spent on materials for new single-family and multifamily construction. While 7% might seem modest, the concentration in specific materials creates outsized effects. Lumber represents $8.5 billion of these construction imports, with 70% originating from Canada. This means that roughly $6 billion worth of Canadian lumber flows into American construction sites annually, making it one of the most import-dependent sectors in the entire construction supply chain. When tariffs hit this concentrated import stream, the effects are immediate and unavoidable for builders who have structured their operations around predictable Canadian supply. Survey data from the National Association of Home Builders reveals how quickly these effects are translating into real costs. As of April 2025, 60% of homebuilders were already experiencing tariff-related price increases. However, the remaining 40% reported no cost effects, indicating significant fragmentation in how these impacts are distributed across the market. This variation reflects differences in regional supply chains, company size, inventory management practices, and the ability to source alternative materials. The geographic distribution of these impacts follows predictable patterns based on trade flows and construction activity. Texas, Florida, and California have been identified as the states most exposed to price shocks, primarily because they combine high construction volumes with heavy reliance on imported materials. These states don't just build more homes, they've developed supply chains that depend on the cost advantages and reliability of Canadian lumber. When those supply chains face disruption, the effects cascade through entire regional construction ecosystems. Construction companies are finding that pricing uncertainty may be even more damaging than the higher costs themselves. Builders typically operate on thin margins and rely on accurate cost estimates to bid projects competitively. When lumber prices become unpredictable due to changing tariff rates and supply disruptions, contractors struggle to price projects accurately. Some are building larger buffers into their bids, which increases costs for consumers. Others are avoiding certain types of projects altogether, reducing overall construction activity. The transmission of these costs to consumers follows multiple pathways, with estimates varying significantly based on assumptions about market dynamics and policy duration. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce projects that the average cost of building a U.S. home could rise by an additional $14,000 by the end of 2027 if tariffs on Canadian imports remain in place. This estimate specifically focuses on the incremental impact of current policies, not the total effect of all trade barriers.
When we account for tariffs first imposed during Trump's first presidential term, the total added cost from lumber duties could reach $20,000 per home by 2027. This isn't just a one-time price increase, but a structural shift in construction economics that affects housing affordability for millions of American families. BC Forest Minister Ravi Parmar has estimated that Americans, particularly middle-class families, could pay $15,000 to $20,000 more to purchase or build a home as a direct result of these trade measures. These cost estimates become particularly significant when viewed against broader housing affordability challenges. American home prices are already near record highs, and mortgage rates remain elevated compared to the ultra-low rates of the past decade. Adding thousands of dollars in tariff-related construction costs to homes that are already increasingly unaffordable for middle-class buyers risks creating a deeper housing crisis. The irony is that trade policies intended to protect American jobs and industry may ultimately make homeownership less accessible for American families. The Canadian forestry industry, particularly in British Columbia, is experiencing what can only be described as a systematic dismantling of decades of industrial development. Since the early 1990s, British Columbia has lost more than 40,000 forest sector jobs, representing a massive deindustrialization of communities that have depended on forestry for generations. These aren't just statistics on government spreadsheets. Each job loss represents a family facing economic uncertainty, a small town losing its economic anchor, and a skilled workforce being dispersed to other sectors or regions. Mill closures across the province have accelerated dramatically, driven by a perfect storm of challenges that extend well beyond trade disputes. The mountain pine beetle infestation has killed hundreds of thousands of trees across British Columbia's forests, fundamentally altering the economics of timber harvesting in affected regions. Regulatory challenges have added layers of complexity and cost to forestry operations, while market access restrictions through U.S. tariffs have made it increasingly difficult for mills to operate profitably. According to U.S. industry assessments, Canada maintains approximately 8 billion board feet of what they characterize as excess capacity. This designation becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy as trade barriers make it increasingly difficult for Canadian mills to access their primary market. The fundamental challenge is that Canadian production has become structurally dependent on U.S. market access, with 60 to 70% of Canadian production shipped to the United States. When that market becomes restricted through tariffs, the entire Canadian industry faces an existential crisis. The provincial government of British Columbia has responded with both immediate diplomatic pressure and longer-term structural reforms. Premier David Eby and other provincial leaders have been urging the federal government to make softwood lumber resolution a top national priority in trade negotiations with the United States. They argue that the federal government has been too focused on other trade issues while allowing the forestry sector to bear the brunt of deteriorating Canada-U.S. relations.
Beyond diplomatic efforts, the province is pursuing structural reforms designed to improve the competitiveness of BC forestry operations. These include calls for activated timber sales that would provide mills with more predictable access to raw materials, fast-tracked permitting processes that could reduce regulatory delays, and broader regulatory streamlining to reduce operational costs. The BC Council of Forestry Industries estimates that if the industry could restore production levels to historic norms, it would generate more than $300 million in additional provincial revenue while helping to address the province's budget deficit. The industry consolidation patterns emerging from this crisis reveal sophisticated adaptation strategies that are reshaping the geography of North American lumber production. Canadian firms are pursuing cross-border investment strategies, acquiring U.S. mill capacity that allows them to serve American markets without paying duties. This represents a form of geographic arbitrage, where companies are essentially moving their operations across the border to avoid trade barriers. Major forestry companies are reorganizing their supply chains through vertical integration strategies designed to minimize tariff impact. Some are establishing U.S. subsidiaries that can process Canadian raw materials into finished products south of the border. Others are developing hybrid models where initial processing occurs in Canada, but value-added operations move to the United States. These adaptations require substantial capital investment and often result in job losses in Canadian communities as production shifts southward. The U.S. Lumber Coalition has developed a comprehensive narrative that positions current trade enforcement as both economically necessary and strategically successful. They claim the ability to supply the vast majority of domestic lumber needs, attributing the 8.8 billion board feet of capacity additions since 2016 directly to trade law enforcement. This represents a fundamental argument that protective measures create the investment incentives necessary for domestic industry expansion. Their housing production calculations suggest that additional U.S. capacity is sufficient to build lumber for 2 million single-family homes, a figure that supports broader arguments about American industrial self-sufficiency. The coalition emphasizes that $7 billion has already been collected in duties, with an additional $1.3 billion pending from recent Commerce Department determinations. From their perspective, these aren't just trade enforcement measures, but revenue generation mechanisms that benefit U.S. taxpayers while supporting domestic industry. The market structure implications reveal how trade protection fundamentally alters competitive dynamics. Weak lumber markets have limited Canadian companies' ability to pass tariff costs through to consumers, meaning the duties are directly impacting Canadian company balance sheets rather than being absorbed by American buyers. This creates a competitive rebalancing where U.S. mills gain market share through protected pricing that doesn't necessarily reflect underlying cost advantages or efficiency improvements.
U.S. industry financial statements increasingly show improved profitability and market positioning as Canadian competitors face duty-related cost disadvantages. This protected profitability enables continued investment in capacity expansion, creating a self-reinforcing cycle where trade protection generates the financial resources necessary for domestic industry growth. The strategic goals of the U.S. industry extend far beyond temporary market share gains. They are explicitly seeking what they term capacity rationalization, which means downsizing Canadian excess capacity to create permanent market space for U.S. production. This represents a fundamental shift in North American production geography, moving lumber manufacturing capacity from Canada to the United States through policy intervention rather than market competition. Andrew Miller, chair and owner of Stimson Lumber Company, argues that Canada's massive excess lumber capacity, coupled with their lead to ship 60 to 70% of production into the U.S. market, creates structural incentives for unfair trade practices. The U.S. industry views current enforcement actions as correcting these structural imbalances, rather than simply protecting domestic producers from competition. Perhaps most significantly, the Lumber Coalition sees these trade actions as establishing precedents for other industrial sectors facing import competition. The model of using anti-dumping and countervailing duty investigations to reshape entire industries could be applied to steel, aluminum, chemicals, or other sectors where domestic producers argue they face unfair foreign competition. This makes the lumber dispute a test case for broader industrial policy approaches that prioritize domestic production over international trade integration. The lumber wars represent more than a trade dispute between neighboring countries. They embody fundamental questions about economic integration, industrial policy, and the role of government in shaping market outcomes. As this $20 billion conflict continues to unfold, it will determine not just the future of North American forestry, but the broader framework for how trade policy intersects with housing affordability, regional development, and international economic relationships. The resolution of this dispute will establish precedents that extend far beyond lumber mills and construction sites, defining the architecture of North American economic integration for years to come.